Hello. Good afternoon, everyone.
Todos bem? Mais um encontro do Tiaços. Queria agradecer a presença de todos aqui hoje. A gente vai se aproximando do final do ano. Temos ainda algumas novidades para o Tiaços. E hoje, particularmente aqui, muito felizes em receber George Hogensos. George, é um prazer enorme te receber. Vou fazer primeiro a tua apresentação formal e depois te contar um pouco a história desse convite, de como é que surgiu essa ideia. George Hogensos é analista de data sênior na Sociedade de Chicago de Analistas Jungianos. Ele possui doutorado em filosofia pela Yale University e mestrado em serviço social clínico pela Universidade de Chicago. Ele é ex-presidente do Instituto Jung de Chicago e ex-vice-presidente da Associação Internacional de Psicologia Analítica. Também atua no conselho editorial do Journal da Analytical Psychology. Seu livro Jung's Struggle with Freud continua sendo uma fonte importante sobre as primeiras controvérsias no movimento psicanalítico. E nos últimos 20 anos, o Dr. Hogensos tem sido um ativo participante nas discussões sobre a teoria dos arquétipos, além de outras questões teóricas em psicologia analítica. Jorge, um prazer tê-lo aqui. Nós já tínhamos lido vários textos...
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Bom, que bom. Bom te ter aqui. Nós já tínhamos lido vários textos seus no Journal, mas eu queria especificar dois textos que eu li sobre você, dois textos teus, que me levaram a fazer o convite para você vir falar aqui. Um é um texto seu que está nesse livro, Jung e Filosofia, que é um texto sobre o debate sobre a questão do arquétipo, que eu acho que é um texto fundamental, primoroso, e que tem muito a ser discutido nele. E um outro texto...
Okay.
Peraí. Que está no Jung para os nossos tempos, que é o Caso Schreber e a origem do livro vermelho. Nós, aqui no Brasil, estávamos terminando um seminário de 2 anos sobre o caso Schreber, estudando paranoia. Então, quando nós lemos o seu texto, nós achamos que seria uma oportunidade excepcional de juntar teoria do arquétipo, caso Schreber e livro vermelho. Nós fizemos o convite, você muito gentilmente aceitou. Por favor, sinta-se à vontade. É um trabalho meio pretensioso, né? Meio audacioso.
I have to do one thing first, which is to say hello to my dear friend, Denise Ramos. Denise and I first met in 2001 when she chaired the debate between myself and Anthony Stevens on the nature of archetypes at the International Congress in Cambridge, which we needn't go in. We may end up, if you want to talk about the archetypal material, we may end up back there, but Denise and I have talked many times about those events, which were memorable, shall we say. Would that be about right, Denise?
It's wonderful that could accept Marcus' invitation. Thank you very much.
Well, it's delightful to see you. We were also together at one time in Moscow and lecturing there, and we've been together on and off for years now on the IAP executive and otherwise. So it's very good to see you. Given Marcus's introduction, the way that he framed the introduction with the paper on archetypes and also the paper on Schreber, and we were talking for a moment before we all came online here. Let me say a word or two about I don't want to go into great detail about my own background, but it may be a little bit helpful. I've been a clinician for 30 years. I was telling Marcus, I did my clinical training at the University of Chicago, finished that in 1990. And my analytic training I completed in 1998. But I started working on Jung in 1975 as a graduate student at Yale University in the Department of Philosophy. And I wrote my book on Jung and Freud, which is actually a heavily revised version of my PhD dissertation in philosophy. It was originally published in 1983. And that had to do with what I viewed at the time to be the dynamics of the conflict between Jung and Freud, which I felt at the time, and frankly, I still feel in many respects, was poorly understood. It was certainly poorly understood by the people writing on the history of psychoanalysis at that period of time in the 1970s and earlier. And I was just looking at some more recent work on Freud, and some of these misconceptions about what exactly it was they were arguing about persist to this day in the Freud literature. The Schreber case comes up. I addressed the Schreber case to a limited degree in that early work. There were a number of other issues that I identified as particularly critical for the debate between Freud and Jung throughout their relationship. And, but I didn't develop the Schreber case at great length. And so a few years ago, I decided, as you probably know, if you've read some of my other papers that I've written over the last 20 years on archetypes and so on, a lot of what I've done there has had a very formal quality to it, even a mathematical quality in some instances. But I've never lost an interest in the historical background to this material, going back to the debate between Freud and Jung. And when the Red Book came out in 2009, Tom Kirsch in San Francisco contacted me to work with him on putting on what actually was the first conference on the Red Book held in San Francisco in July of 2010. That was eventually published. I think that book, the proceedings there came out in 2013. And as part of that, I wrote a paper for that conference, which I reference both in my Schreber paper, and I'll talk about it when I have a piece that I'm going to read over to sort of orient things today. I did pick up on this question of medievalism in Jung, although I wasn't addressing the Schreber case explicitly in that paper. But again, it was going back to some of these historical questions about the conflict between Freud and Jung. And then going forward with the Schreber, with the Red Book, and thinking about it more, I got pulled back into looking at Schreber, not so much, and I will be very interested. It's fascinating to me that you've had a 2-year seminar on the Schreber material. What I was doing in looking at Schreber was, again, looking at the particular characteristics of the debate between Freud and Jung over the interpretation of psychosis, which is one of the earliest points of conflict that they have with one another. As I say in the paper, a couple places, it literally shows up in the second or third letter that they exchange with one another. And it develops over the course of the time that they're working together. It becomes more and more intense as they try to negotiate the relationship between Freud's psychoanalysis and Jung's emerging ideas about the nature of the psyche. And so this paper on Schreber is a little bit of a speculative piece on my part, of trying to push the boundaries a little bit in terms of how this debate yields the Red Book. And we can come back to that. I think one of the things that's beginning to be evident about the Red Book in terms of the scholarship on the Red Book, or people writing about the Red Book, is that the Red Book has become almost a Rorschach test in its own right, that different readers read into it very different things. They read into it their own interests. For example, the British analyst Liz Green, who is also a practicing astrologer and has written, maybe you're familiar with, 2 recent books, one where she tracks Jung's interest in astrology over time, does an extraordinary job of revealing to us how deeply involved with astrological imagery he was. But she then goes, for example, and virtually reads the Red Book as an astrological text. I've seen other people writing on the Red Book that read it as if it were a tarot deck, or as it's this, that, or the other thing. So the Red Book is become sort of a Rorschach. The way that I've been thinking about it for purposes of this material, and I would say that may not be the last word that I have to say about the subject, but is that it's a more substantially grounded effort on Jung's part to investigate certain psychic phenomena that play into this debate between himself and Freud. Now, if you read my paper, the Schreber paper that was published in Murray Stein's collection, and some of the other material, what I think I'm going to do, just to sort of get some other ideas on the table, some stuff that I've been thinking about more recently since I wrote that Schreber paper. One of the things that I wouldn't say that I'm deeply focused on right now, but that I'm increasingly curious about, is the way in which Lacan, for example, interprets the Schreber case and how that relates to it. Frankly, I think it relates back to the debate between Jung and Freud, although Lacan doesn't bring Jung into the picture. So I'm looking a little bit at that, and there's some other material that I think that has interested me for quite a while, particularly around the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, that I'm sort of playing around with and looking at this. So with that in mind, and I've got a short little paper here. It's only about 7 pages that I'll go through. It will mention some of these things. Quite frankly, it repeats some elements that are in the paper, the Schreber paper that I published. You'll hear them again if you've read that paper. And then at that point, I'm completely open to discussion, whether it's on the archetypes material, referring to that one paper that Marcus mentioned, that's in that Jung and Philosophy book, or any of the other work on archetypes. Perfectly happy to talk about that. Perfectly happy to talk about the Schreber material, particularly as it pertains to the overall structure of the debate between Freud and Jung. So with that in mind, let me just go through this. So I'm going to skip the first paragraph, he said, which is basically thanking you for the invitation. That's all that's in the first paragraph, which I'm very grateful for. So reading now. I want to begin with some formal comments, which I hope will set the stage for conversation. The title of my presentation is Further Reflections on the Schreber Case and Jung's Medievalism. In my response to Marcus's request for a title, I also included the following passage by Jung from the Red Book, quoting Jung, "I must catch up with a piece of the Middle Ages within myself. We have only finished the Middle Ages of others. I must begin early in that period when the hermits died out. This is a, end quote. This is a passage in the Red Book that I've addressed elsewhere, particularly in a paper I presented at the first conference on the Red Book in 2009, organized in San Francisco by Tom Kirsch. The title of that paper was another passage in the Red Book, quote, "The wealth of the soul exists in images," end quote. I will reference this portion of the paper at the conclusion of this presentation. My interest in the question of the medieval in Jung rests on a question that has been on my mind since well before the appearance of the Red Book. Why does Jung choose the term archetype to define such a fundamental element of his system? The question arises because the term has an unusually long and complex history and played a critical role in the codification of the place of a certain class of image, the icon, as distinct from the idol in the history of Christianity. Although the term is often compared to other terms in the history of philosophy, going back to Plato's ideas, but also including Kant's categories of the understanding and a variety of other supposed parallels, none of these are adequate, it seems to me, to the significance associated with the tradition of the archetype as it was deployed, particularly in the Middle Ages. I will return to this shortly. Another background issue that will bring us closer to the Schreber case is attention given to the medieval, the Middle Ages, by a group of writers focused on developments in philosophy and psychoanalysis, particularly in the French context, but also with elements in German philosophy, notably Heidegger. A quick look at some titles illustrate the point. In 2005, Bruce Hulsinger at the University of Virginia published an overview of the influence of the medieval on French theorists, beginning with Bataille, but moving through Lacan, Derrida, Bourdieu, and Barthes, titled The Pre-Modern Condition, a play on Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition. Aaron Levy, one of the authors of the paper cited in my earlier Schreber paper, has an extended study, Lacan's Medievalism, that goes into greater detail on Lacan's interest in and use of medieval materials. The volume that I cited in the Schreber paper, The Legitimacy of the Middle Ages, edited by Andrew Cole and D. Vance Smith, with an afterword by the social theorist Frederick Jameson, is subtitled On the Unwritten History of Theory. Once again, the title of this book is an ironic play off the monumental study by the philosopher Hans Blumenberg, The Legitimacy of the Modern Age, which argues against the idea that modernity emerges from a secularization of medieval categories and is rather distinctly different, marked by the emergence of a new self-determined sense of the person. The argument of Aaron Levy and Michel Ubel in their paper, We Have Never Been Schreber, Paranoia, Medieval and Modern, follows this formula. Schreber is trapped in a modern world that does not understand that the problematic presented by his psychotic delusional system is in fact a medieval problem. Commenting on Schreber through a Foucauldian lens, they write, now I'm quoting from them, Schreber's certainty about spirituality's deep roots in divine communication necessitates a return to the mixture of heroic strength and innocence that Foucault characterizes as departure points for modernity. Judge Schreber, as modern Lancelot, did the precise opposite of what Hans Blumenberg considered characteristic of modern culture. That is, fill in traditional spiritual forms with a modern secular content. He conveyed to the modern Weltanschauung a traditional religious content, one remarkably consistent with medieval aesthetic theory and practice, as realized, for instance, in the mystical aims of Gothic architecture. The Gothic cathedrals, such as that of Saint Denis, embodied a Neoplatonic vision based upon analogies between Dionysian light ray metaphysics and Gothic luminosity. Within Schreber's Gothic vision, the rays or souls by which he felt himself connected to the divine were proof of God's miraculous creative power, which is directed to earth. His supporting evidence reflects the intimacy common to the mystic, the fact that the sun has for years spoken to me in human words, and thereby reveals herself as a living being or as the organ of a higher, still higher being behind her. That's the end of that quotation. There is, however, a serious problem with Lévy and Hubel's position, and it is tied directly to the psychoanalytic, or more correctly, Freudian Lacanian view of the primacy of language. In my earlier work on the conflict between Jung and Freud, I identified a series of theoretical points on which they differed, among which was what I called at the time the primacy of the word over the primacy of the image. Given Lacan's central role in the discussion of theory, I have just mentioned, it is, I believe, appropriate to turn to him for a clear and definitive account of this distinction, given that he also sees it as central to the conflict between Freud and Jung. And here's a quotation that I already had in the paper on Schreber. You've heard it before. In Écrit, he writes, quoting Lacan, "It is of the utmost importance to observe in the experience of the unconscious other, where Freud is our guide, that the question does not find its outlines in protomorphic proliferations of the image, in vegetative intumescences, or in animastic halos radiating from the palpitations of life." This is the whole difference between Freud's orientation and that of Jung's school, which latches onto such forms, Wandlungen der Libido. These forms may be brought to the fore in a mantic, for they can be produced using the proper techniques, promoting imaginary creations such as reveries, drawings, etc., in a suitable site. This site can be seen in the veil of the narcissistic mirage, which is eminently suited to sustaining whatever is reflected in it through its effect of seduction and capture. If Freud rejected this mantic, it was at the point at which it neglects the guiding function of a signifying articulation, which operates on the basis of the internal law of material subjected to the poverty that is essential to it. Similarly, it is precisely to the extent that this style of articulation has been maintained by virtue of the Freudian word, verba, that such a profound difference persists between the two schools. Now, I'm going to deviate from the text for just a moment here. This is an area, this is something that I don't have an answer precisely to my question here. But Lacan met with Freud in 1954. And I haven't been able to unearth, it maybe exists, a more detailed account of what their conversation was about at that time. For the most part, what gets repeated from that encounter between Lacan and Jung is Lacan supposedly repeated many times in the seminars and so on, Jung's account of a remark Freud made on the 1909 trip to the United States, when Freud supposedly remarked to Jung, "They do not realize that we bring them the plague." Freud had a very inflated sense of what the impact of his theories were going to be in his first presentation in the United States his only presentation in the United States in 1909 at the Clark University conference. And there's reason to believe that he was actually disappointed that the Americans didn't run out of the auditorium where he was presenting in revolt against his theories and so on. That's what he kind of expected. At any rate, Lacan apparently really liked this comment that Jung told him Freud had made. The only other place that we have something that I quite sincerely believe gives us more information about what took place in that 1954 meeting is this quotation. And in reading it over myself, my own speculation, and that's all it is at this point, is that at some point in their conversation, several things happened. Obviously, Lacan was familiar, must have been familiar with some of the earlier work by Jung. We can talk about that, why he doesn't seem to mention Jung in his early work on psychosis, like his dissertation and so on. I don't know how he was able to do that, but I suspect that in 1954, Lacan may have actually seen a copy of the Red Book, or seen the Red Book itself, and talked to Jung about how Jung went about doing this work, which is where we get this rhetoric of in accordance with a certain mantic, for example. In other words, a magical procedure, which would be very much in line with what we typically think of as active imagination and Jung's the deep meditative state that Jung engaged in order when he was doing the Black Books and so on. Now, that's a speculative comment there, but I think that it informs the way in which Lacan is setting up the distinction and the particular language that he uses in doing that. We can come back to that because I've got some thoughts about what Lacan is doing with his own interpretation of Schreber. They're preliminary, but we can go into that later. So, I don't have a lot of space to work with here. Returning to my text. The word not only takes priority over the image, it effectively consigns the image to the realm of narcissistic autoerotism. This also plays a role in subsequent events between Jung and Freud after the break. How does this fit with Schreber and from there to Jung? In Schreber's account of his delusional system, he engages in a process that he refers to as picturing. Levy and Ubel approach Schreber from a Lacanian standpoint. Approaching Schreber from a Lacanian standpoint, view this process as a defense mechanism to ward off the voices and sense that he is being observed at all times. Schreber did in fact enact his delusions, dressing like a woman as he became increasingly convinced that God was turning him into a woman in order to have intercourse and begin the repopulation of the world, which had been destroyed at the outset of this psychotic process. But as I've argued in my book, Jung's Struggle with Freud, Freud's own neurotic tendency to faint when confronted with what he experienced as Oedipal challenges to his authority over the unconscious was a move from language to image, an enactment of the killing of the father. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, famous among other things for his investigations of the textuality of the human condition, in other words, the word side of the human condition, nevertheless presents what I believe is a critical distinction, medieval in origin, that I believe sheds light on these situations. In an important essay entitled Manifestation and Proclamation, he lays out the possibility of the appearance of the sacred in forms other than proclamations or other discursive events. When he talks about proclamation, he's talking about such things as parables, Jesus' parables as proclamations and so on. These verbally based, he talks about it. So I will need to develop this theme further at a later date, but I would suggest that both Schreber's and Freud's enactments are manifestations of phenomena that lie beyond or behind the range of discursive or textual formulation. In other words, they are not accessible to the word, but they are accessible to the image, which would be Jung's argument on the deep unconscious. This brings us back to the question of the medieval in Jung. In the concluding paragraph to the draft portion of Liber Secundus, Jung locates himself in relation to a point of origin for addressing the image. I must catch up with the piece of the Middle Ages within myself. We have only finished with the Middle Ages of others. I must begin early, in that period when the hermits died out. Earlier in the book, Jung had already alerted the reader to the importance of the medieval period for his understanding his project, and had provided something of a guide where we should look. To find their soul, he writes on page 236a, the ancients went into the desert. This is an image. The ancients lived their symbols since the world had not yet become real for them. Going back to what I said a moment ago about both Schreber and Freud enacting the underlying foundations, the more hidden foundations of their theory, corresponds to this, I believe, in a fairly interesting way, that the going into the desert in this instance is an image because of a particular relationship in relationship, as he says, to the real, to find their soul. So there's this underlying enactment or manifestation of a phenomenon rather than simply a discursive description of it. Back to the text. In the case of the image, one critical point in the early Middle Ages is the early 8th century, when Leo III, emperor in the East, precipitated the iconoclastic controversy. In condemning the use of images, Leo took a decisive step in the history of Christianity, one that would return in various forms for the next 1,000 years or more. Needless to say, Leo had ancient grounds for forbidding the use of images and Mosaic prohibition on graven images. Leo proceeded, however, without consulting the other branch of the Christian church in the person of Pope Gregory II, for whom images retained a useful role in the instruction of the illiterate. Further conflict ensued, with the argument moving back and forth between iconoclasts and iconophiles until the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 787 declared the validity of images, a decision that was reinforced by a subsequent council in 843. In an important essay, The Prototype and the Image, concerning these events and their consequences, the philosopher of religion, Jean-Luc Marion, argues for the intimate relationship between the icon and what Jung would call the archetype in itself. This is quoting Marion, Jean-Luc Marion. Whereas in imitation, the more the derived image is perfected, the less it depends upon the glory of its model, to the point that the tangential autarky of the glory inevitably drives it to the self-reference of an idol. In other words, the idol becomes the object of worship. The icon, on the contrary, glorifies itself only by returning all glory to the invisible. And in the Council of Nicaea discussions of the icon, the invisible was referred to, they also referred to it that the icon refers to the archetype, to the invisible. Iconoclasm criticizes the supposed idolatrous deviation of icons because it persists in interpreting according to the logic of similitude and mimetic rivalry without ever suspecting or accepting that the tupos has categorically broken away from any imitation of an original. The icon does not represent, it presents, not in the sense of producing a new presence, as in a painting, but in the sense of making present the holiness of the Holy One. Just a comment or two on this particular passage so that it makes a little more sense of why I'm throwing it into the middle of a discussion of psychoanalysis, is that you can read Freud and by extension Lacan and his comments on the distinction between word and image as a play off of this long-running historical discussion of the iconoclasm in the West. Freud, of course, coming out of the Jewish tradition, is going to be very interested in the word, and there is an intrinsic rejection of the validity of the image in that tradition. And if you read people like David Bacon's book on Freud and the Jewish mystical tradition and other sources, a variety of other sources, you can see this influence of Freud's Jewish background and the way in which he structures his theory. But Lacan picks it up, and the idea of rejecting the image as having this kind of autoerotic, narcissistic quality to it reads to me very much like this iconoclastic approach to things. Now, on the other hand, if we begin, and here we may go over into the discussion of archetypes a little bit. If we view the archetypal image, not as a representation of the archetype, but as Marianne would put it here, it does not represent, it presents the archetype, not in the sense of producing a new presence as in a painting, but in the sense of making present the holiness of the Holy One, making present the archetype in an individual's life. We can begin to see how these elements link up with one another. Back to my text. Returning then to Jung's choice of the term archetype for his deepest intuitions about the structure of the psyche, I would suggest that he is following a much more closely the medieval analysis of the relationship between the image, now seen as the icon, and that which it shows forth or makes present, the archetype. I conclude, therefore, that in terms of theory building, analytical psychology can first of all learn from the theorizing in the sources I have cited, but not at the expense of subordinating Jung to that model. Rather, Jung's medievalism should become a guiding aspect of our understanding of Jung and a counterpoint to the arguments of Lacan and others. And that's the end of that. So with that said, I'm going to take another sip of water, and then I'm perfectly happy to start a conversation and see where we go with all of this.
Obrigado, George. Vamos seguir a prática das perguntas. Quem quiser fazer as suas questões, coloca o nome no chat, eu chamo e a pessoa faz a pergunta. George, queria começar com...
I have to say one thing because I realize it's happening. I have a lifelong minor congenital circumstance with my hands. They shake a lot. If you see my hands shaking, please don't worry about it. I don't have any serious problem, but they'll be jiggling quite a bit.
Fique à vontade, por favor. George, eu queria começar com uma pergunta, que é pensar... Você trouxe Lacan, né, que eu acho que é uma referência absolutamente fundamental, e pensar em Lacan é pensar na importância da questão da linguagem. Você acha que... Eu fiquei lembrando do teste de associação de palavras do Jung. Ele começa, de alguma maneira, pela via da linguagem, pela questão da linguagem lá no teste, né? Você acha que é possível, de alguma maneira, produzir uma teoria da linguagem ou encontrar uma teoria da linguagem dentro do Jung, dentro do projeto junguiano? Ou essa é uma questão que se tornou secundária? Ela não é primordial? Qual é a tua opinião?
Well, I haven't gotten as deeply into Lacan's reading of Schreber as I want to. I need to get into that. Let me say one thing about Lacan, and then I'll come back to Jung and language here. One of the things that strikes me about Lacan, you'll see in my little paper on Schreber, where I point to Freud, or to Jung's criticism of Freud's paranoia paper, where he basically says, you know that you can't. They've been arguing about the problem of psychosis from the very, very beginning. It's in one of the very early letters, I think I cited in that paper, that Jung says, I just don't think you can account for a variety of phenomena, but one of them is a phenomena of psychotic behavior, ideation, with your theory. And you get then to the paranoia paper, and they're already very much in conflict with one another by that point. And Jung says, nice, very, very nice effort, but you don't solve the problem of psychosis. And you know that you don't, because you effectively say that you can't solve the problem in a footnote to your essay, and it's right there. You realize that you can't do it. Now, the one comment that I'd make on Lacan's approach here is that Lacan, it seems to me, what Lacan does is he comes back around on this question, and it makes the argument. He's now introduces the name of the Father as one of his guiding principles, and he basically says that Schreber does not have access to the name of the Father. And in his psychosis papers, Lacan says that it is the absence of the name of the Father leads to psychosis. If you have the name of the Father, then you move towards neurosis. And I'm just going to, I haven't gone far enough with working all of this out, so I'm trying to kind of protect myself a little bit here. That it appears to me that Lacan is trying to restore Freud's interpretation to position of primacy by making this particular argument about this very Lacanian argument about the way that language works in his theory, to resuscitate the argument that Freud failed to make in the paranoia paper. So just putting that aside as a sort of side issue. Now, the question of whether there's a theory of language in Jung. The paper that I wrote in 2001 that actually was kind of the foundation for the debate, part of the foundation for the debate that I had with Anthony Stevens at Cambridge that Denise chaired for us. Involves the American psychologist James Mark Baldwin. And that gets us into another strange space here with the French psychologist Genet and Flournoy and the philosopher Henri Bergson and so on that I touch on in that paper that Marcus referred to on archetypes. In Wandlung and Symbole der Libido, Jung makes a footnote reference to Baldwin and question of language there, where he says language is an image. Now, he doesn't develop that very far, but it appears, if we just take that very, very, very limited point, very, very small point, excuse me, we get into an interesting question of whether, while Lacan and others want to exclude the image and validate the word, whether Jung almost, if you were pressed on the point, would reverse the polarity and talk about the language being a form of image in the way in which he thinks about it. Now, several of the papers that I've written over the years, I kind of return from time to time to this example that Jung has of the image which comes out of the material he gets mainly from the British comparative psychologist Conway Lloyd Morgan, and in particular the leaf-cutting ant that he talks about. And what he says there is that the image of the leaf-cutting ant includes the ant, the leaves that it cuts, the little garden of fungi that it creates out of the leaves, the little creatures that reside on the fungi that the leaf-cutting ant can then milk for. And if you get into the biology, it goes on and on and on. And he says that this is the image of the leaf-cutting ant. If any of these elements are missing, the image doesn't exist. So extremely important when we talk about an image or an archetypal image or anything else is that we're talking about an entire contextual arrangement. We're talking about a gestalt. We're not talking about some item that might sit on the shelf in a museum and you say, oh, that's an archetypal image. It's not. It's not an archetypal image unless it is embedded and genuinely embedded, not just a simulation of its embedding, but embedded in the context in which it actually functioned as an image, as a expression of the archetype. So if we take that Gestalt notion a little bit, I'm pushing Marcus into some, I'm on one of my little speculative riffs here, which is kind of what I do a lot of. We begin to think of language not as a discrete form, but as an element within a larger Gestalt. And now we move into language as an element within the image world. So I think there might be a way of doing it that along those lines. Let me just think for a minute about other possible avenues there. I think I should probably pause. Otherwise, I got to watch myself that I don't go off into into wild speculations. I have a tendency to do that. It's important for me to write things, because when I'm writing things, I actually have to sit down and think them through in a little more detail. So I'm going to at least pause here. We can maybe come back to it. It's a good question. It's an interesting question. That's my first response to it, is where Jung does mention that language is also an image. At least that's the way it comes out. And now, with image, you have to be a little bit careful. I'm working off of the English translation. I haven't gone back and looked at that in the German. I have the complete works in German, so I can check it. But you'll sometimes Jung uses Bild in the German, and sometimes he actually uses Gestalt when he's and they both end up getting translated as image frequently in the English translation. I don't know how it would be in Portuguese or other languages. And candidly, I haven't gone back and looked at the German for that footnote. I probably will when we're done here, just to find out what does he say language as a Gestalt, or does he say language as a Bild? I don't know. And the German's down in my basement. I don't want to run down there right now and find it.
Obrigado, George. Vamos, novas perguntas, depois a gente volta. Luciana, contigo, por favor.
Oi, George. Obrigada pela sua inteligente apresentação. Fiquei impressionada. Eu queria voltar para o final da sua apresentação, onde você fala que a imagem arquetípica ela não representa, mas ela apresenta, torna presente o arquétipo na vida do indivíduo. E eu fiquei pensando qual seria a aplicação disso na nossa clínica, se existe alguma diferença na nossa prática clínica a partir dessa afirmação. Queria saber a tua opinião.
Well, I have a client who made a very interesting comment to me just a couple of weeks ago. And I won't go into all of the details, but I think it's illustrative of this. We have been working for a number of years on an aspect of his relationships with people that have a distinctly archetypal quality to them. In terms of the investment, the idealization and investment that he has made in serial relationships. He's an older man. Over the years that have relationship will begin, a homosexual relationship will begin that becomes very very invested with enormous amount of affect and for lack of a better word, we could call it an archetypal investment. And then they, as one would expect with the trying to invest a concrete relationship with archetypal dimensions, they eventually fail. They eventually fail and moves on to another relationship that takes on that same quality. Well, due to a variety of factors, partly age, it's getting quite a bit older, partly analysis, I hope. I think we do something that's useful in this regard. That process of that serial investment is not happening at this point. And the comment that he made to me is, it feels as though the archetype is looking. He says, I can feel the archetype wanting to find something. Which struck me as a very interesting way of talking about this, that the structural form that we would refer to as the archetype in itself is it is seeking a way to instantiate itself. It's seeking a way to manifest itself. Now, here we go to this manifestation question from Recur. To manifest itself again. There's been, like I say, years and years of manifestations of the archetypal form. And this, he's a very, very intelligent, very well-educated individual. So he's quite sophisticated in the way that he can talk. And we've worked together for quite a long time. That the archetype in itself, the way he's talking about it, I think it's worth thinking about. I need to ponder it more myself. Seeks out ways of showing itself in the world. If we take that back to Marianne and so on, what the argument with the iconoclasts in the Council of Nicaea in 784 and so on was that as they put it in the actual documents of the Council of Nicaea, the icon as opposed to the idol. You see, if you went to the Parthenon in Greece and you have a statue of Athena of Athens, you worshipped the idol. Athena was in the Athena of Athens was in that statue, or Zeus or the others. If you went to Athena in some other part of the Greek world, then Athena was there. I mean, in the idol, that's the way that, at least the way that was being interpreted. When they talk about the icon at the Council of Nicaea, they will talk, rather than, you don't worship the icon, by veneration, you get the interesting linguistic distinction between worship and veneration. If you venerate the icon, it's like it transmits that veneration to the archetype being God, Christian God in the Christian tradition. So rather than having the archetype present in the object here, that's the idol, you have, by way of the icon, you transmit your veneration to the archetype. Now, I think that's very interesting in thinking about, for example, my client's comment. He wanted the archetype to be present in these relationships, and it's not. That's why they eventually fail. You can't, it drives me up, but it doesn't drive me up. I'm sure that you have all had particularly young men who show up in your practice and they've fallen in love with some beautiful young woman, and they come in and they say, "Is she my anima?" And to which the answer is no. Your anima's a figure, an archetypal figure in the collective unconscious. And no, she's a lovely young woman. Enjoy your relationship. She's not your anima. She may be what the anima is using to manifest in your life, but she's not your anima. And that's the distinction between the archetype in itself and the archetypal image. So people try to attach these archetypal images, or the archetype in itself, to the image, in my client's case, serial relationships, but they fail. So, I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I think we have to watch very carefully how we move between the idea of the archetype in itself and the manifestation of the archetype in some physical presence, something that we can actually work with and not confuse the two. And our clients will be, at least in my experience, a lot of people that come in, if they come for a Jungian analysis, it's because they want to learn about their archetypes. And that's not quite the way it's going to work for them clinically. I mean, just a footnote on my own practice. I think it's, now this may sound, if you read my very technical papers on archetypes and symbols and things like that, this may sound a little anomalous, but for me, the key in the consulting room is what is the felt affective sense of where we are in the process. It's not what's being talked about, it's what's the affective field feel like. And the simple way that I put it when I'm talking to our trainees here is that if I feel like the client or the patient has an emotional reaction to something, but I'm not getting a strong feeling myself, and this is very schematic, it's obviously subtler than this. I think in terms of complexes that they're experiencing. When I feel like we're both beginning to get caught in some kind of affective field, I then begin to think we're probably moving closer to archetypal material. And on rare occasions, in my experience, when it feels to me as if the entire room is sort of taking on its own dimensions, and I don't have control over things, and the client doesn't have control over things. Schematically, then I began to think in terms of the self being more present, the whole organizing process, and the client and the analyst both lose agency in that kind of very powerful, but in my experience, relatively rare affective field. And you have to be very, very careful yourself when you get into that space, because here's where Jung will talk about sort of, falling into your own transformational process and so on. That's clinical stuff.
Ótimo, obrigada.
Jorge, queria fazer duas perguntas.
Does that help, by the way? Does what I'm saying, I don't know, if you have questions about how I formulate something, please tell me.
Queria fazer duas perguntas. Uma é continuar no tema do arquétipo e pensar o seguinte: você colocou uma questão de que o Schreber é um caso moderno, né? É um caso moderno, entretanto, com conteúdos medievais, por assim dizer. Aí a minha pergunta é o conceito de arquétipo que nos permitiria unir o medieval com a modernidade? Quer dizer, é a hipótese teórica do arquétipo que nos permitiria pensar num conteúdo medieval encontrando ressonâncias num sujeito moderno? Se a Denise quiser participar também dessa pergunta, Denise, fica à vontade. Você acha que poderia funcionar desse jeito?
Oh, now I follow a little better. Well, yes, I think that this, I have to emphasize, and I'm working on this. It's ongoing, all right. But first of all, these people that I was citing in the paper, who are working out of the Lacanian model, are basically saying that that's very much a role that Schreber has to play. It's just that he's trying too hard to make it modern. One can talk about, see, for example, Flechsig, who was the psychiatrist who was running the hospital where Schreber was, for the majority of the time that he was hospitalized, he's under Flechsig's control. And Flechsig was this, he was an ardent neuroanatomist. I believe in my paper, I cite this comment that he makes in his inaugural address when he takes over the position, where he says he's taking it over from an earlier generation that was this kind of humanistic psychiatry, more romantic, German romanticism and so on. And he comes right out and says, that's Middle Ages, and we're stopping it right here. And, but it's a curious point of interpretation whether Schreber's focus on nerves in the way that God communicates with him. And of course, Freud has a point. Freud is, I don't want to make Freud out to be completely wrong about the way that he understands some of these things. That Flechsig has this kind of godlike quality at times in Schreber's delusional system. that God communicates rays to Schreber's nerves. And there's this way in which Schreber is trying to sort of force his psychosis into something resembling a modern model, but it causes difficulties for him. It may not be appropriate, and it sort of gets him to deviate. Now, I think that this question I guess I would say, I think that this idea of the role of the image is more important here than, so these two people that I cite in there, following Lacan, take the picturing part of Schreber's delusional system when he says, I picture because I want to present an image. I want God to have something to see, just like God gives me things to see in my dreams. That's a rough rendering of something that Schreber says. I don't know, I'd have to go pull it out of the text, but they interpret, coming at it from the Lacanian Freudian side of things, is that this is a defense mechanism. This is a way of occupying his mind in such a way that he doesn't have to pay attention to the voices and the paranoia. That's their interpretation of what it means to be picturing. Now, this would be it seems to me to be an avenue, certainly I suggest in what I just read that it's an avenue back to Jung, because for Jung, the picturing would not be a defense mechanism. It would be the way of opening up the reality that he's dealing with. Keep in mind when Jung and you find it both in the 1925 seminars, and then it reappears in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Jung says about his so-called encounter with the unconscious is that he feels that he's becoming overwhelmed by affect, overwhelmed by an emotional state. And then he says, when I could find the image in the affect, this calmed me. This is something, by the way, that I use clinically. If somebody has a very disturbing emotional states that they can't pin down, I will encourage them to draw, to do other ways of literally trying to construct an image on paper. I have collections of these things from people I've worked with over the years. And I can tell you about one of those that in fact has to do with a close to a psychotic state. We can come back to that. That the picturing is in fact a way in which Schreber brings containment to his sense, just like Jung brings containment to his emotional states by way of finding the image in the affect, and that's what we get then in the Red Book. Now, if we go back to things like Marianne and so on, and those discussions of the role, and I have there's a footnote in that I draw from. If you go back and look at the if you really look, and this is part of the problem with the iconoclasm debate, but it goes way beyond that, is the extraordinarily important role that the image played in the Middle Ages. And it wasn't just for educational purposes. And this is why Ricoeur picks up on this idea of manifestation. As the sacred is really revealed through manifestation through images. And it's a little more complicated than that. But I suspect that if we pick up on Schreber's picturing and don't discount it by way of the Lacanian Freudian emphasis on the word, we'll begin to see the route through Jung to that medieval side of things. I don't know if that responds, Marcus, but it's what kind of comes to mind as we're talking here.
Ok, tá ótimo. Vamos lá, Letícia, por favor.
Oi, pronto. Então, eu pensei em perguntar aqui, só voltando em algumas questões, a Lu falou um pouco, você comentou um pouco sobre já, mas eu queria só aprofundar numa questão. Quando você fala sobre que o arquétipo apresenta, né? Você fala da diferença também entre arquétipo e a imagem arquetípica, né? Você falou de ânima também. E eu lembro em Arquétipos e Inconsciente Coletivo do Jung, ele diz ânima ser um conceito experimental e não uma teoria. Ele compara com o conceito de artrópodes, né? De nomear um grupo de fenômenos análogos e afins. Talvez você poderia falar um pouco sobre esse certo nominalismo do Jung e talvez também, se tiver relação com essa pergunta, falar sobre essa relação de Jung com Kant.
Jung and Kant. Okay, well, that's an interesting list of things. Where do I start? Let's start with Jung and Kant for just a second. We've got Jung and Kant, we've got Jung and Schopenhauer, we've got Jung and Nietzsche, we've got Jung and Plato, we have Jung and Augustine, we have Jung and I don't recall him talking about Descartes. We have Jung and Leibniz, very important relationship between Jung and Leibniz. The problem is that Jung wasn't really trained in philosophy, so a little bit of his relationship to all of these thinkers is a little tenuous at times in terms of really how well he understands them. But the fact that he sees in all of them some kind of precursor to his work is not inconsequential. More recently, by which I mean over the last 5 or 6 years, and this goes back to a conference that was held at Essex University, actually it goes back a little bit before that, I've become very interested in the role that Bergson plays in Jung's development. Not so much, not as explicitly as Kant, but there is a very complicated network of relationships where Bergson is very much at the center of it. And I think I touch on this in the paper that on archetypes that Marcus referenced at the beginning, where the influence of Bergson is much more important than we've realized. There are a number of papers. John Hall has a couple of very important papers on Bergson and somnambulism. There's a few others. Sonosam Dasani picks it up. But I've begun to think, particularly because of a book that I encountered some years ago by a British philosopher by the name of Christian Kerslake. The book's title is Deleuze and the Unconscious. And it has a lot on Jung in there, and it has had a significant shaping influence on my more recent thinking about some of this. Deleuze and the Unconscious. It's a little hard to get hold of that book, but Now you're talking about Kevin Liu's, one of his presentations on archetypes. Was that what you were referencing? Did you mention Kevin Liu? Okay, well then I misheard, because I was going to say I'm not sure what he thinks about it. I know he made a presentation to you. I thought maybe it came up in there. I think what I would say, because I've been working on the archetypes business, as you know, for a long time now, trying to get a handle on it. Denise certainly is well aware of that. When I step back from trying to use it as something that informs my clinical practice, I really think that one has to view, Jung says this from time to time, and we don't take it seriously enough, that he is proposing hypotheses. He's not, Jung himself will say that he's not trying to put forward a thoroughly worked out theory. He's much more cautious about that. And I think that when we're thinking, and this is pretty clear how it's played out in theorizing about archetypes by the variety of formulations that have been put out there. Gene Knox and developmental. I've got this, Joe Cambry and I talk about emergence. The physicist Harold Altmansbacher in his dual aspect monism, has another way of talking about archetypes that are close to the emergence model. Anthony Stevens and Eric Goodwin in particular are taking a very biological evolutionary approach to archetypes. And in some degree, all of them, and I include myself in that, are trying to come with some way of pinning down a more stable way of talking about archetypes than we find in Jung. Sometimes it sounds like he's got a stable idea, but the fact of the matter is he doesn't. And Jean Knox, years ago, in her book on archetype and attachment, points out that there's at least 4 major different ways that Jung talks about archetypes. And that has sort of played itself out over the entire history of analytical psychology. One can actually ask the question, do we have any solid foundation for talking about archetypes in the first place? I think we do, for a variety of reasons. The Freudians frequently like to be very critical of the Jungians for talking about archetypes, but I think Jung is absolutely 100% correct when in one of the late interviews that he gives, he says Freud's problem was that he was in the grip of an archetype and he couldn't get away from it. And that is a characteristic of the archetype. It's what I was talking about with my client. It's what I talk about when I talk about the clinical application of these ideas, that the archetype you begin to feel literally in the room that you are not fully in control of things. Should we put names on archetypes? This really bothers me sometimes. Going to your question about the anima. If we pick up on Schreber for just a moment, and also on the Red Book, I think an argument can be made about the Schreber case that as he begins to move into his psychotic delusional system, what's the, well, the first thing that happens to him is the destruction of the world. Now, it turns out that Bleuler and Jung, in their work with psychotic patients, they effectively identified this sense of losing the world as almost a prodromal phenomenon associated with moving into schizophrenia, into dementia praecox, into a psychotic state, which I would say is the reason Jung is so worried about his visions of the destruction of Europe before the beginning of World War I. They associated this kind of destruction of the world images with you're slipping into psychosis. And Jung worries about that. And then, as he says in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, when the war breaks out, he feels enormously relieved. And he even writes about that in a letter that he sent to Mircea Eliade years later, that he felt tremendously relieved when the war broke out because he realized that no, he wasn't slipping into psychosis. He may have been having something like premonitory images of the outbreak of the war, which frankly, in that period of time wouldn't have been the least bit surprising for people to be expecting war to break out. It was everywhere at the time. And so he wasn't going into a psychosis. That's step number one. Step number two is Schreber begins to experience himself as this transformation into a woman, this movement into the feminine. What's the first thing that Jung really encounters in the Red Book? He encounters Salome and Elijah. Now, from that, I could imagine him beginning to think that, all right, as one moves in, and notice that my argument about the role of the Schreber case in the origins of the Red Book is that Jung is basically saying, and if we go to the debate with Freud, the particular qualities of the argument that he has with Freud right at the very end of their relationship in this exchange of letters around Freud's paranoia paper is what it boils down to is you can give an account of the withdrawal of libido from an object, from one object, and that gives you a theory of neurosis. But we agree that in psychosis, there's a withdrawal of libido from all objects. That's the destruction of the world. The world, in other words, loses all libidinal investment. You can talk about neurosis being a withdrawal of libido from one object and fitting that into your theory of the unconscious, the particular way that you, Freud, conceive of the unconscious, but you can't bring the withdrawal of libido from all objects and fit it into your theory. And you can't fit it all into your own theory of the unconscious. You can say more about that. And my thought here is that although he's been thinking that the idea of a sort of collective unconscious has been around for a while, this is where Jung begins to understand that he has to construct some new dimension to the unconscious to absorb that global withdrawal of libido. Now, both Freud will say that the project of the psychotic patient, the project of a Schreber, is to try to rebuild their world. Jung is going to say, yes, they'll try to rebuild their world by resources that are available, by the structures that are available in the collective unconscious. That's the archetypal dimension. And then drawing on available material, whether it's nerves and Flechsig for Schreber, or as Sandasani points out in relation to the Red Book, this vast material that Jung has acquired over the years. But the shaping of that will take place in accordance with these archetypal structuring processes. the first thing that gets structured for a man, is this movement towards the feminine. You can call that anima, you can call it movement towards the feminine, you can call it anything you want to. Jung continues to use these Latinate terms to define an awful lot of these things, and anima is what comes to mind there. But it's one way of looking at it is that the movement through the process of delving deeper into the collective unconscious, moving closer to the experience of psychosis, if you want to call it that, seems to yield a pattern that is fairly regular, at least in the early stages. And then you move into these other dimensions of that. Naming them, this interview I did with Joe Cambry, I go off on one of my particular problems that I have with the way a lot of analytical psychology talks about archetypes, which is what I characterize as the archetype of this, that, and the other thing. It's as if, I don't know how this is in Latin America, but one of the things that's happened in the United States is whenever somebody wants to call something an archetype, they call it an archetype. And they have no particular grounds for why they would call it an archetype, in my opinion. That's a bit of me being crotchety. Disagreeable in my old age. I don't know if that sort of fits into your question or not, but the point being that the most important thing is that Jung does refer to a lot of this as hypotheses. And if they're hypotheses, then we have to look for ways of elaborating them and testing them. On the Kant question, I think I mentioned this already, there's all of these other philosophers. Kant, of course, is extraordinarily and probably the single most important figure in modern philosophy in many respects. It would be impossible to say something without addressing Kant, but I'm not sure that, other than the fact that Kant has this way of carving up cognitive structure by way of the categories of understanding and the modalities and the rest of his system, I'm not sure that it's really something that yields a great deal of insight. One thing on the Kant side that is again neglected in some of the historical work has to do with what was probably the way Jung was educated in biology. Again, something I haven't pursued, but the German biologists and German evolutionary theorists after Darwin, there was the dominant figure there was a fellow named Baer, B-A-I-R, I believe, who was very, very Kantian. They did have a different way of thinking about evolution, even within the Darwinian context in Germany for quite a long period of time. And it wasn't anti-Darwinian, but it was different in some important respects, and it has a very Kantian cast to it. So that probably fit into Jung's biological training in university. But again, it's one of those things that, maybe Sonosama Masani will figure out, but I haven't pursued it.
Obrigado, Letícia. Martinha, contigo, Martinha.
Oi. Primeiro, obrigada aí pela palestra, achei muito interessante, né, tudo que você trouxe. E eu estava pensando aqui na questão, né, que você estava falando do arquétipo, né, e assim, qual é o uso, muitas vezes, que é feito, pelo menos aqui, assim, é como se as pessoas quisessem, né, nomear tantos os arquétipos. Eu fiquei sabendo aqui no Brasil, né, de um curso que foi dado, que é sobre a anciã, arquétipo da anciã. E aí fazendo os estágios, né? Infância, né? A criança, a donzela, a mãe e a anciã. Só que quando chega na anciã, aí começa de novo uma coisa, é anciã, menina, yes. Anciã, donzela, anciã. Então, isso daí acaba ficando, de uma certa maneira, reduzindo, né? Eu acho que amarrando, em vez de ser um estímulo, né? Da imagem, né? Para além, né? Quer dizer, usar essa coisa junguiana até para restringir, reduzir, né? Reduzir. Então, como é que eu uso, né? Entre a palavra e a imagem, o que é importante é que ela leve para além, né? Não que ela reduza já no significado já pré-acionado, né? Então, eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho disso.
Well, that's exactly what I would say. And it makes me very annoyed at times. I don't know whether you have it in Brazil, but in the United States, it's become a big part of businesses talking about, the archetype, this and that and the other thing, or branding of products being archetypal. There are books along these lines, and amongst trainees, sometimes I think it's changed a little bit recently, but there was a period of time in the training programs in the United States where the way I characterize it, it's as if when you came to writing a thesis in your training program to become an analyst, you had to find some new archetype to talk about. And it went on and on and on. And some of them are just ridiculous. And, to which I ask the question, so if you think it's an archetype, why? What makes this an archetype? And usually you don't get a very good answer. So my comment is is to say, yes, I think, Marta, your point is exactly correct. It's very frustrating. I've gotten to the point now where I tell my trainees, let's not put a name on your complexes too fast. Let's definitely not put a name on archetypal material too fast. Just slow down. Clinically speaking, the affect, for me, affect is the most important element of the clinical discussion of these things. What's the feeling tone, and what are the dimensions of the feeling tone? And I'm not going to worry about it a lot if it's mother or father or anima or God knows what else. Yeah, well, I think I'll leave it there. I was going to go talk a little bit about, we can talk about some things Jung has to say about complexes and how they interact with one another, and how psychic energy works along these lines. We'll get going on that. But no, the point, I completely agree with you, and it drives me up a wall. I don't know if you have that expression in Portuguese or not, but you come up with something close to it.
Yeah. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Martinha. Jorge, queria fazer a última pergunta para você. Queria voltar um pouquinho no Schreber.
Okay.
Foi Jung quem apresentou Schreber a Freud, né? Schreber, por assim dizer, seria o mais junguiano dos casos de paranoia da literatura. E por que há tão pouca escrita junguiana sobre o caso Schreber? Por que os junguianos escrevem tão pouco sobre Schreber? Você tem alguma
Let me get a
hipótese?
piece of paper here for a minute. That is a good question. I had written another introductory paper before I wrote the one that I sent to you. It was getting kind of long and convoluted and so on. But I specifically brought that question up in it. Michael Van Oy Adams has a fairly extended paper on Schreber, where he says basically the same thing you just said, Marcus. It's obviously one of the most Jungian cases you could look for, and there's nothing much said about it. I went in, I don't, you may be familiar with, are you familiar with the psychoanalytic electronic library, or what? It's all of the journals, you know, are online through this service. And you can do sophisticated searches. So I went to the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and I simply did a search against the Journal of Analytical Psychology for references to Schreber, anything referencing Schreber. 21 instances in the entire Journal of Analytical Psychology, mentions of Schreber. And that's just mentions, that, and some of those are book reviews. They're not even articles. The International Journal of Psychoanalysis, which is a longstanding psychoanalytic journal, 269 references to Schreber. The Psychoanalytic Quarterly, 183 references to Schreber. And the Journal of Analytical Psychology has 21. I don't know what the answer to the question is, but I think it's an important one. The thing is that one problem is, and this presents a larger problem, I think, for analytical psychology, that the psychoanalytic literature, with a couple of exceptions. I mentioned the psychoanalyst Zvi Lothing, who has done a lot of work on Schreber, a huge amount. He has a book that thick on Schreber. And he's written several important papers on the debate between Jung and Freud over Schreber, and they're excellent. Lothing's a very, very rigorous, competent, honest scholar. I really admire his work very deeply. But otherwise, the psychoanalytic literature takes Freud's paranoia paper as if that were the last word on Schreber, that that's the way things were working for Schreber, and that he and they never touch on the Freud-Jung debate about Schreber. An earlier version of my paper on Schreber, Heong Shen in China had invited me over to China to lecture a few years ago. And I don't know how he arranged this, but it fell at the same time as the conference of the Chinese Psychoanalytic Association. And they were they were scheduled 5 brief keynote presentations at the beginning of that. And somehow or other, Heong got arranged for me to give one of the 5 keynote speeches. These were short, they weren't big, you know, they were each about 20 minutes long. And the 4 other people were psychoanalysts. including the then vice president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. I was the vice president of the International, of the AAP. And I gave a shorter version of my Schreber paper as that keynote address. And quite a number of psychoanalysts came up to me afterwards and thanked me for it, because they said we had absolutely no idea that any of that had happened. They'd never heard about Jung's response to Freud's paper. They didn't even know that Jung had given Schreber, or given the Schreber case to Freud. It was as if Freud, this Freudian interpretation just popped up. Freud did it, and there was never any question about it. And so they were really kind of surprised that, oh, there really was a substantive argument between these guys about the interpretation of Schreber. Why the Jungians haven't done more with it? I don't know. I've been very curious. I've been asking myself the same question. And Adams, you know, I know Adams asked the question. And it, you know, it makes perfect sense. I mean, the real, you know, if you want a sort of singular foundation for the debate between analytical psychology and psychoanalysis, beginning with Jung and Freud, it's the debate over neurosis versus psychosis. That starts from the beginning. They never resolve it. There's a very, very real way in which you can't understand Jung unless you understand his early work on psychotic states in the Burke-Hulsey, what that meant for his whole orientation towards the psyche, and why we aren't paying attention to this, you know, singular case from that period. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you, but it's certainly a problem, it seems to me. And I'm personally, I'm switching back and forth with, you know, do I work, how much more energy do I put into the Schreber case and actually working some of these things out that I've been talking about? How much energy do I put back into some of the other stuff I've done on archetypes over the years, including the Bergson connection, which is much more complicated and important than we realized. That's my problem. But there's a lot to be done. And I dare say I applaud a 2-year seminar on Schreber in Brazil. I mean, thank goodness somebody's paying attention to this stuff. Because up here, it's sort of me, it seems. I don't have a lot of time. And, you know, so yeah, it's a good question. Don't have an answer for it.
Claro, claro. No nosso seminário sobre paranoia, aqui, nós estudamos o texto do Michael Van Adens durante 1 ano e meio. E é um texto que eu acho fundamental para entender esse caso, né? Somente a questão da libido, né? Da diferença da libido na psicanálise e na psicologia analítica. Jorge, obrigado pela tua presença. Queria te agradecer.
Well, yes.
Cada tema desse que você trouxe, Caso Schreber, Teoria dos Arquétipos e Red Book, é um universo, né? Então, são muitas coisas, são muitos temas. Queria agradecer a tua gentileza em estar conosco, em dividir teus pensamentos. Para nós, uma alegria e uma honra muito grande poder te ouvir. Obrigado pela tua presença.
Thank you.
Espero que a gente
I appreciate the invitation. I hope we'll have another opportunity to spend time with each other. So, bye-bye.
Abraço. Até lá. Muito obrigado.
I'm going to leave now. Bye-bye.
Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Mais um Tiaços. A gente volta agora no dia 5, né, Lu? Dia 5 de novembro, com Michael Van, que vai apresentar o livro do Wolfgang Gigris, Trabalhando com os Sonhos. Tá bom? Fica o convite já para vocês. Bom final de semana. Isa, obrigado. Lu, beijo grande. Até a próxima, pessoal.